A bell rang at the same hour every morning at Kashasha. It rang before the light had fully settled into the hills, when the red earth paths that ran between the low rises of the Kagera region were still the color of rust in the early gray, and the sound of it moved outward from the mission buildings in the way that sounds do in open country, not sharply, not with urgency, but in a wide, slow ring that reached the nearest trees, and then the nearest slope, and then the wide, flat country beyond, carrying with it the particular message that here, in this place, the day was now beginning in the prescribed manner. The bell was iron. It hung from a wooden frame near the main building of the school, and whoever rang it did so by pulling a short rope, and the tone it produced was not musical, exactly, but full, round, and dependable, the kind of sound that once you had heard it enough mornings in succession, became part of the texture of the place, rather than a separate event within it. The girls at Kashasha knew the bell before they were fully awake. They heard it from their dormitory beds, in the moment between sleep and not sleep, when the body knows a sound without the mind having to interpret it, and by the time full consciousness arrived, the sound had already done its work, and the day had already begun. The school had been founded by Christian missionaries to educate girls from the surrounding rural communities of the Kagera region, in the part of East Africa that was, in the early 1960s, known as Tanganyika. The missionaries who ran Kashasha came from a tradition of institutional order, morning bells and evening prayers, and scheduled hours of labor and learning arranged in a sequence designed to produce, at its end, a particular kind of formed person. The school was a boarding school, which meant the girls lived there rather than walking from home each day, which meant the schedule was not just the rhythm of their waking hours, but the whole structure of their existence from one week to the next. Each morning after the bell, the dormitory rooms would fill with the sounds of girls rising, the creak of narrow bed frames, the pour of water from a basin, the particular rustle of institutional clothing being put on in the half-dark. The beds in the dormitory were arranged in rows and made up in the morning to a consistent standard, each thin mattress covered with a blanket folded to the same dimensions, the same position, the same degree of neatness from one end of the room to the other. The repetition of those identical beds was its own kind of institutional grammar, a physical statement that here sameness is order, and order is what the day requires. Academic instruction followed morning religious observance. Manual labor had its appointed hours. Meals were communal and governed by European missionary staff who maintained standards of conduct at the table the same way they maintained standards of conduct everywhere else in the school, with calm expectation and the occasional correction. The girls who attended Kashasha had come from surrounding villages, many of them from families where the rhythms of the day were shaped by agriculture and seasonal pattern and the particular textures of rural community life. And the school sat across all of that, like something placed there from a very different idea of how time should pass. The Kagera region in which Kashasha stood is a place of low hills and wide views and red laterite paths that wind between patches of farming land and the particular lush green that comes from proximity to water. Lake Victoria lies to the north and east of the region, enormous and flat, more of an inland sea than a lake by any useful measure, and from the higher ground near Kashasha, the lake showed itself on clear days as a brightness at the horizon, not quite visible in detail but present, wide, the kind of feature that orients a landscape simply by existing at the edge of it. The paths that ran through the hills around Kashasha connected the school to a network of villages, and those villages to each other, and the whole network to the regional center of Bukoba, some distance along the lake shore. In 1962, those paths were traveled primarily on foot, sometimes by bicycle, occasionally by motor vehicle where the roads permitted, and the movement of people along them was the way that news and goods and social life circulated through the region. A school like Hashasha sat within this network even as it stood apart from it. The girls who lived there had walked those paths to arrive, and they walked them again whenever the school permitted, and their families knew the paths between home and Kashasha the way families know any route between where their children are and where they came from. The school's daily schedule was consistent and unvarying in the way that institutional schedules are built to be. Morning religious observance gave way to morning lessons. Lessons gave way to midday. The afternoon had its own divisions. In the evening there were prayers again, and then the dormitory, and then the bell again in the morning, to begin the sequence once more. For the girls who lived within this schedule, the repetition was both the structure of their education and the entire shape of their present existence. There was not, in such a routine, a great deal of room for anything that fell outside it. January 30th, 1962, was a day that sat within that routine in the way that all the days before it had sat within it, until at some point in the day it did not. 3 adolescent girls began to laugh. The accounts of precisely how this began are, as accounts of such things tend to be, not entirely consistent in their details. Whether all 3 began simultaneously, or whether one began first and the others followed within moments, is not something the historical record settles with certainty. What witnesses described was that the laughter began suddenly in the particular involuntary way that distinguishes laughter that has started on its own from laughter that a person has chosen to produce. It escalated. It did not stop when the girls might reasonably have been expected to stop. For those nearby, the first impression of the laughter might have been simply that something was funny, that the particular combination of end-of-day exhaustion and the accumulated pressure of institutional life had produced in these 3 girls, sitting near each other in the particular stillness that follows a long afternoon of lessons, the kind of laughter that catches and cannot be stopped, familiar to anyone who has ever laughed at something at the wrong moment and found the wrongness of it only made the laughing worse. But this impression, if it was held at all, did not persist. The laughter went on. It deepened rather than resolving. And then, watching it, something in the expression of the girls shifted. What had looked like laughter from a distance began to show its edges, distress beneath the sound, the face doing something that was not quite what laughter alone does to a face, a quality of not being in control that was different from the ordinary helplessness of finding something very funny. Researchers who studied the outbreak in later years and the 1962 Tanganyika laughter epidemic became, over the following decades, one of the most extensively studied cases of mass psychogenic illness recorded in the 20th century. Described the onset in these terms: uncontrollable laughter beginning among a small number of individuals, escalating beyond the apparent control of those experiencing it, and transitioning at points into crying and visible distress. The laughter and the crying were not separate events, but aspects of the same episode, which is part of what made the thing so difficult for the teachers and mission staff who witnessed it to know how to respond. A missionary teacher standing in the doorway of a classroom where girls cannot stop laughing faces a particular kind of institutional difficulty. The tools available to a person in that position: a firm voice, a clear instruction, an appeal to composure, an invocation of the religious values that the school existed to transmit, are tools designed for a student who is at some level choosing her behavior, and might be persuaded or commanded to choose differently. They are not designed for a student who appears genuinely unable to stop, and whose inability to stop does not seem to be a performance of inability. The teachers at Kashasha tried verbal commands. They tried separating the affected girls from each other. They appealed to religious composure in the way that people in their position, in that institutional context, would have been trained to do. None of it worked, not in the way that it was supposed to work. The laughter continued through the interventions. More students became affected over the days that followed. The girls who were affected were not, it seemed, choosing to be affected, and this observation, that whatever this was did not respond to the ordinary mechanisms by which institutional authority shapes individual behavior, placed the teachers and missionary staff in a position for which their training had not prepared them. The dormitory at night would have held the same rows of beds, the same folded blankets, the same institutional sameness from one end of the room to the other, and the beds were still made up in the morning with the same hands that had always made them, but some of those hands now trembled, that or belonged to girls who had spent part of the previous day or night laughing in a way they could not control. The school continued its routine. The bell rang at the same hour. The sequence of morning observance and academic instruction and communal meals went on in the way that institutional schedules go on, even when the people within them are not entirely well. But the number of affected students was growing. Over the weeks that followed the initial outbreak, more girls began to experience episodes. The laughter moved through the school population in the particular way that researchers would later describe as characteristic of mass psychogenic illness. Not uniform, not simultaneous, but social, following lines of proximity and shared daily life, spreading among students who lived and ate and slept and studied together, rather than distributing itself randomly across the school population. Girls who had not yet been affected watched the ones who had. The teachers watched all of them. The mission staff attempted to maintain the structure of the schedule around an outbreak that the structure had no way of containing. By February and into March, the scale of the situation at Kashasha had made the continuation of normal school operations genuinely difficult. The number of girls experiencing episodes at any given time was sufficient to disrupt the academic program. The interventions that had been attempted had not produced lasting resolution, and the condition showed no sign of the natural self-limiting that school administrators might have hoped for. No week in which the episodes subsided and the ordinary life of the institution reasserted itself clearly enough to suggest that the unusual period was drawing to a close. The school at Kashasha was part of a tradition of mission education in East Africa that had, by 1962, been establishing and operating schools in the region for several decades. The particular rhythms and expectations of such a school, the institutional order, the European-derived framework of daily life, the religious observance that structured the morning and the evening, the communal meals, and the scheduled labor and the academic instruction, were not new. What was new in 1962 was the particular circumstances of the region. Tanganyika had become an independent nation on December 9, 1961, just weeks before the initial outbreak at Kashasha. The country the school stood in was not quite the same country it had been the previous year, not in its formal political structure, and the communities surrounding the school were communities navigating that transition alongside all the other pressures of their daily existence. The girls at Kashasha were in most cases adolescents, the particular age at which the relationship between individual identity and institutional expectation is rarely simple, and at which the body is in the process of negotiating its own changes alongside the external changes of the world around it. They had come from rural communities to live within a boarding school governed by rules derived from a different cultural tradition. They worked in Swahili or English, languages that carried the formal requirements of their education rather than the particular ease of the languages they had grown up speaking at home. The school bell rang and the day began, and the sequence of institutional expectations unfolded in the same order it always did, and the girls lived within it as they had been living within it until the morning that some of them could not. On March 18th, 1962, approximately 7 weeks after the first recorded episodes of uncontrollable laughter among the three initial students, the administrators of Kashasha School formally closed the institution. The closure was intended to be temporary. The thinking, as far as it is possible to reconstruct it from the historical record, was that a break in the institutional setting that seemed to be sustaining the outbreak would allow the condition to resolve, that returning the students to their home environments, removing them from the particular social world of the school, would interrupt whatever was propagating the episodes from one girl to the next. This was a reasonable inference given what was observable, even if the people making it did not yet have a framework for understanding what they were observing. The days leading up to the closure had been marked by the particular institutional activity of a school preparing to send its students home ahead of an ordinary schedule. Belongings gathered, correspondence sent to families, the logistics of transport arranged for students who lived too far to walk easily, the school grounds, which normally held the steady hum of a working institutional day, would have begun to feel slightly looser, slightly less structured, as the usual schedule gave way to the practical business of departure. On the morning of March 18th, the gates of the school stood open. Students filed out with their belongings, wrapped in cloth bundles or carried in bags, the accumulated possessions of a school term gathered into whatever form made them manageable for the journey home. Some of the girls who walked through those gates on that morning had experienced episodes of laughter in the weeks before. Some had watched others experience them. Some had spent nights in a dormitory where the sounds of distress had moved through the darkness from one bed to the next, in the way that sounds in institutional spaces at night are never quite as private as the architecture might suggest. The road from Kashasha ran south and east toward the network of villages from which the students had originally come, and it ran through country that was in early March, still holding the warmth of the season, red earth paths drying in the sun, the hills on either side covered in the particular combination of cultivated land and natural growth that characterizes the Kagera region, the lake not visible from every point on the road, but present in the quality of the air, the particular light that comes from proximity to an enormous body of water. The girls who walked that road on the day of the closure were walking toward home, which was something, and away from school, which in the current circumstances was also something, and carrying with them the experience of the previous 7 weeks, in whatever way experience is carried, not left behind with the institution that generated it, but moved with the body that had lived it. To the north, from the higher ground near the school, the lake was visible as a brightness on the horizon. Wide and flat and unhurried, it held the light the way it always did, indifferent in the specific pleasant way of large natural features to the particular human events taking place at its edges. The Kagera region on that March morning was the same landscape it had always been, the same hills, the same red paths, the same low sky over the wide water. What had changed over the 7 weeks since the end of January was something that the landscape itself could not reflect, and the school bell could not measure, and the neat rows of dormitory beds could not explain. The administrators who had ordered the closure expected in due course to reopen. The students who walked through the gates expected in due course to return. The institution had been closed before as a matter of routine, for holidays, for maintenance, for the ordinary breaks that punctuate any school year. This closure was to be the same kind of thing, extended slightly, a measured response to an unusual situation, temporary by design and by intention. The gates standing open on March 18th, 1962, were standing open in the way that gates stand open when the expectation is that they will close again at the appointed time. What no one standing at those gates on that morning knew, not the administrators, not the missionary staff, not the girls walking out onto the road, was that the closure of Kashasha was not the end of the episode, but something closer to its acceleration. The students who walked away from the school that March morning walked toward their home villages, carrying with them the experience they had accumulated in those 7 weeks, and in some of those villages, the laughter would begin again. The school had been closed in order to stop the spread of something through a contained population, but the population was no longer contained. The bell would not ring at Kashasha on the morning of March 19th, or for some weeks after. The dormitory beds would sit empty, the blankets folded in their institutional precision, with no one occupying the mattresses beneath them. The school grounds would have the particular quiet of a built space, gone temporarily unused, not abandoned, but paused, waiting for the routine to resume. The sound that had moved out from the mission buildings every morning into the surrounding hills and the red-earthed paths would not be there for the birds and the early walkers and the wide flat light to carry. The bell would wait, as objects wait, with no urgency and no awareness of what was moving through the landscape, while it was still. On the road south from Kashasha, the girls who had already set off were walking home. The dust of the path settled behind each of them in the still morning air. The hills that had been visible from the school windows were the same hills that would come into view around the next bend of the path in a few minutes, seen from a different angle, at a slightly different distance, the familiar shapes of home country announcing themselves gradually as the journey continued. Ahead of each girl, the particular village she had come from. Behind her, the school gates standing open in the late dry season light, the lake to the north a brightness, at the edge of the known world, and something, though no one walking that road that morning would have had a name for it, still very much in motion. The episode that had begun in the last days of January, in whatever specific moment 3 girls had begun to laugh together in the exhausted stillness of a school afternoon, had not ended with the closing of the school. The school had simply been the place where it started. The roads leading away from it, and the villages those roads led toward, and the families and neighbors, and market days, and ordinary social life that waited at the other end of each journey. All of that was ahead. The gates stood open, the students filed through, and in the quiet that followed their departure, the Kashasha school waited with the reasonable institutional confidence of a place that expects to resume its purpose shortly, for the moment when the bell would ring again. Lake Victoria, seen from the higher ground of the Kagra region, does not look quite like water at first. It looks like the sky has come down and settled. On clear mornings in early 1962, from the paths that ran along the low ridges above the lake's southwestern shore, the surface stretched out so wide and so flat that the far side of it was not visible at all, just more water, then haze, then nothing particular to fix the eye on. The lake is the largest in Africa. It holds more surface area than many countries, and from the ground beside it, that scale is not abstract. It is simply the fact of the horizon, and the horizon is water. The communities that lived along the southwestern shore of Lake Victoria had oriented themselves toward that water for generations. The lake provided fish. It set the mood of the light in the morning and the evening. Its weather moved inland in the form of clouds that built up in the afternoon over the open water and arrived above the villages by late day. The red laterite paths that connected homesteads to gardens, villages to markets, and the Kagera region to the rest of northwestern Tanganyika all ran more or less parallel to the lake's edge for long stretches, as if even the roads had arranged themselves to stay within sight of it. The names people used to describe their own location often included the lake as a reference point, a direction, a near or far thing to reckon from. Kashasha village itself sat close to the southwestern shore, in a part of the Kagera region where the land rolled in low hills covered with a mix of cultivated gardens and scrub vegetation, the soil red and pale orange underfoot, the air carrying the particular smell of that specific combination of earth, water, and cook fire smoke that belongs to the lakeshore communities of East Africa. The regional town of Bukoba lay to the north, closer to the lake's edge, serving as the closest point of formal administration, commerce, and transport connection for the surrounding rural areas. Between the villages and the town ran those same red paths, wide enough for foot traffic and bicycles, occasionally for a motor vehicle raising a long trail of dust behind it. The distances measured more by walking time than by any posted marker. This was the physical world in which the Kashasha school stood, and in which the broader events of early 1962 would unfold. To understand those events even partially, it helps to hold that geography clearly, not the geography of a map with neat lines and labeled borders, but the geography of daily movement, the morning walk to the water point, the path to the garden, the longer road to the market, the still longer road to Bukoba and back. The world of the Kagera region in 1962 was a world that people moved through on foot, that information crossed by voice, and that was held together by the dense fabric of family, community, and regular gathering that characterized rural life along the lake. The town of Bukoba, for anyone arriving from the surrounding countryside, would have presented a clear shift in visual texture. Colonial-era administrative buildings sat alongside newer structures, their proportions and materials different from the round or rectangular mud brick homes of the rural homesteads, their purposes, offices, post, stores, the functions of formal governance, belonging to a different register of daily life. The lake was visible from Bukoba's edge, closer here than in the more inland villages, the town having grown up partly because of its access to the water. Steamers moved across the lake between Bukoba and other ports. There was a market. There were streets after a fashion, rather than paths. For a girl arriving from one of the smaller communities to the south or east, Bukoba represented the nearest edge of the wider world, the place where the rhythms of village life gave way to something more various and harder to read. Market days in Bukoba and in the smaller trading centers scattered through the Kagera region were among the most important social events in the calendar. Traders arrived on foot and by bicycle along the red laterite roads, carrying goods in bundles and baskets, and they carried news alongside those goods in the way that had always been the function of such gatherings. Word of a drought in a neighboring district, news of a birth or a death in a village 2 days' walk away, the report of something unusual, seen or heard, all of this moved through the market in the same unhurried channels as the prices of dried fish and the quality of the coffee harvest. There were no telephones in most of the rural Kagera region in 1962. The radio was limited. Written communication was slow and not universal. The market, the shared path, the visit between family compounds, These were the infrastructure of information, and they were effective. Unusual events did not remain local for long. The year 1962 had a particular quality in Tanganyika that the years before it had not had, and that quality was newness. The country had only very recently become its own, and the specific date of that becoming was December 9th, 1961, just weeks before the events at Kashasha began. For decades before that date, the territory had been ministered first by Germany, as German East Africa, and then by Britain, under a League of Nations mandate, and later a United Nations trusteeship following the First World War. The mechanics of that colonial administration had shaped almost every institution in the country: the schools, the hospitals, the courts, the roads, and the transition to independence did not remove those structures overnight. What it did was change who stood at the top of them, and what that change meant for the people who lived within them was still being worked out in January of 1962. Julius Nyerere was the man who led Tanganyika to that independence. He was a school teacher before he was a politician, which is a detail worth pausing on given the particular setting in which the 1962 epidemic began. Hans, born in 1922 in the Butiama area of northwestern Tanganyika, not far in geographic terms from the Kagera region, Nyerere had trained as a teacher and spent time teaching at Catholic mission schools before entering politics. He founded the Tanganyika African National Union in 1954, a political organization that worked through nonviolent advocacy toward the goal of self-governance, and when independence came, it came in a form that reflected Nyerere's particular political approach, measured, organized, and oriented toward building rather than simply dismantling. He became the country's first prime minister on December 9th, 1961, the day the flag changed. The mood of that independence period in Tanganyika has been described by historians in terms that carry a certain weight of mixed feeling. There was genuine celebration. The achievement was real, and the desire for it had been broad and deeply held. Photographs from December 1961 in Dar es Salaam, the country's capital on the Indian Ocean coast, show crowds, flags, and the particular quality of public brightness that belongs to collective occasions of historical significance. In the capital city, in the administrative centers, in the gathering places of those who had been most directly involved in the political struggle, the atmosphere of that day was one of arrival, of something long sought having finally become true. Outside the capital, in the rural regions, in the Kagera region, near Lake Victoria, in the villages around Kashasha, the felt meaning of independence was more textured. The formal structures that organized daily life had been colonial in origin, and many of those structures remained in place in the same physical form, staffed now by a different set of authorities, or in some cases still by the same people. The mission schools continued their schedules. The administrative offices continued their records. The roads were the same roads. The markets gathered on the same days. Independence was a real and meaningful change, and it was also, in the practical daily terms of life in a rural village in early 1962, something that had happened somewhere else and was still finding its way into the texture of ordinary existence. Scholars studying the Kashasha epidemic have pointed to this transitional period as one of the broad contextual factors worth holding in mind, not as a simple explanation and not as the single cause of anything, but as part of the particular atmosphere of the time. A newly independent country carries within it a kind of suspended energy. The old order ended, the new order not yet fully formed. The expectations that had been organized around the future suddenly required to become the present. For communities that had lived under the specific conditions of colonial institutional life, the boarding school being one of the clearest examples of those conditions, that suspension had a particular sharpness. The rules that governed such institutions came from somewhere. The authority that enforced them had a character and a history. What exactly that authority meant in a newly independent country in January 1962 was not a question with a settled answer. The boarding school, as an institution in the colonial context of East Africa, deserves some attention in itself, because it shaped the daily experience of the girls at Kashasha in ways that were quite distinct from the experience of their families living in the surrounding villages. A girl attending a mission boarding school in the Kagera region in 1962 had left her family compound, her mother tongue, and the social world she had grown up within, and moved into an institution governed by a different language, a different religion, a different set of daily expectations, and a different authority structure. The school day at such institutions was organized from before dawn until after dark, with time allocated to academic instruction, to manual labor, to religious observance, and to communal meals eaten under institutional rules about comportment and silence. The distance between that institutional world and the village world was not only geographic. A girl who had grown up in a homestead organized around extended family, with the particular freedoms and obligations of that social form, found herself in a dormitory room in which her bed was one of a row of identical beds, all made to the same standard, the space between them measured and equal. The language of instruction might be Swahili or English, depending on the school level and the specific institution. The prayers were Christian. The teachers were, in many mission schools in the early 1960s, still European in significant numbers, operating within an institutional framework that had been designed by and for a European religious and educational model transplanted into a very different context. For the girls in such schools, the negotiation between these two worlds, the world of the institution and the world of home, was a constant low-level fact of daily existence, not a crisis, but a permanent condition. That condition carried a weight, not a dramatic weight, not the weight of acute suffering, but the steady accumulated weight of living within structures that had not been designed with the specific humanity of the people inside them fully in mind. The academic demands were real. The behavioral standards were strict. The distance from home was measured in days of walking, not in streets or stops, and the girls living within those institutions were adolescents at the particular age when the weight of social expectation and the pressure of identity are at their most acute, even under ordinary circumstances. None of this is to propose a single explanation for what happened at Kashasha in January of 1962. It is simply to set out the furniture of the world in which those events occurred, so that the events themselves can be understood as things that happened to real people in a real place, rather than as abstractions in a case file. The paths through the Kagera region in early 1962 were the same paths they had been for years, worn into the red earth by generations of feet. Some had been widened by the colonial administration to allow motor vehicle passage, though vehicles were still uncommon enough that their passage was an event worth noting. Most were narrow, traveled on foot or by bicycle, connecting the homesteads and gardens to one another and to the larger social gathering points of the region. Along those paths, in the particular month of January 1962, people moved in the patterns they always moved in, toward markets, toward family, toward water, toward work. The lake was visible from the higher paths and from some of the lower ones on clear days, that familiar brightness sitting at the edge of the known world. What moved along those paths was not only bodies and goods. The Kagera region's social network was dense and well maintained, in the way that social networks tend to be in communities where face to face interaction is the primary medium of all social life. A piece of news generated at any one point within that network could move to most other points within it fairly quickly, carried by the next traveler on the next path, repeated at the next market, passed from one family compound to the next during the next visit. In this way, events that occurred in a school building near the lake's shore could become known in a village 3 hours' walk inland within a matter of days, not as formal news, but as the kind of word of mouth account that travels between people who know each other and trust each other's reporting of unusual things. The regional town of Bukoba served as a node in that network, a place where the threads from multiple surrounding communities converged. Traders from the lake communities arrived there on the same days as traders from the inland villages. Administrative officers received reports from their subordinates in the surrounding areas. Church networks carried information along their own routes between mission stations, schools, and congregations. In a region without telephone infrastructure reaching into the rural communities, without regular newspaper coverage of village events, without any of the formal media by which a modern population would receive news of an unusual occurrence, the informal human network performed this function with considerable efficiency. It had been doing so for a very long time. It knew how. The early weeks of 1962 in Tanganyika were therefore not only the first weeks of an independent nation, though they were that, with all the particular quality of a first chapter in a new kind of story. They were also weeks within a specific, ongoing, well-established social world that had its own rhythms and roots and ways of carrying information, a world that operated according to patterns much older than the new national flag. The market days continued, the paths were walked. The lake moved through its morning colors and its afternoon colors and its evening colors with the complete indifference to political change that very large bodies of water tend to display. Life in the villages around Kashasha in January 1962 had the texture of ordinary life in its particular regional form, and that ordinary life continued to have that texture even as something new and unexpected began to move within it. The social texture of the Kagera region in 1962 also included the particular networks of the schools themselves. Girls at mission boarding schools came from a range of surrounding communities, drawn together into a single institution, from villages that might be separated from one another by many hours of travel. The school therefore created social connections that would not otherwise have existed. Friendships, rivalries, the particular bonds that form between people who share a dormitory room and a dining table, and a set of shared institutional experiences over months and years. When students traveled home, they traveled as people carrying both the experience of the school and the social connections of the school with them. The school was not a sealed world. It was connected to the surrounding communities by the movement of its students, by the family visits that punctuated the school calendar, by the flow of news in both directions along the paths between institution and village. What happened inside the school did not remain entirely inside the school. It traveled. The particular character of the Kagera region's landscape also played a role in shaping the texture of social connection and isolation. The low hills that rolled away from the lake's shore created a series of partially enclosed spaces, valleys with their own communities, ridges with views across to neighboring valleys, the lake always somewhere in the middle distance as the common reference point for the whole region. The distances between settlements were not enormous, but they were distances measured by walking, and walking takes time. And time shapes the way information moves and the way community is maintained. Neighbors who might have been separated by 15 minutes of driving were separated by 2 hours of walking, and that difference mattered for the density and frequency of contact. Communities were connected, but the connections were maintained by effort, by the choice to make the walk, to attend the market, to pay the visit. It is worth holding all of this together for a moment: the specific geography, the lake and the hills, the red paths and the market days, the dense social fabric of a region organized around face to face contact, the institutional world of the mission schools and their particular form of displacement, the particular year of 1962, with its quality of recent change and not yet settled new order, and to recognize that this is not a set of disconnected background conditions. It is rather a description of the specific human world in which the events of early 1962 occurred, a world with particular textures of stress and connection and expectation, a world whose information moved along specific routes through specific people, a world whose institutions carried the specific history of colonial design and its particular relationship to the people those institutions enclosed. A flag had been raised over a government building in Dar es Salaam just weeks before, in the morning heat of December 9th, 1961, the fabric catching the air above a crowd that had gathered for the occasion. The crowd was large. The moment was real, several hundred miles to the northwest, in the Kagera region, along the low hills above the southwestern shore of Lake Victoria. The paths were still the same red paths, and the lake was still the same lake, and the school at Kashasha was still operating on the schedule it had always operated on. The bell rung at the same hour each morning, the dormitory beds made to the same standard, the lessons conducted in the same languages of formal instruction. The country that school stood in had changed its name and its governance on a December morning 6 weeks before. The school itself had not yet changed. The girls inside it had not yet changed, or rather, were in the process of the long, ordinary change of growing up inside an institution that asked a particular kind of patience from them, the patience of people who have learned to live within structures not entirely their own, waiting for the structures to catch up with who they are. That waiting was not dramatic. It was the quiet, accumulated fact of daily life in a particular kind of place, in a particular kind of year. Julius Nyeri, the school teacher who had become a president, had spent years working within the educational institutions of colonial Tanganyika before turning to politics. The fact that the man who led his country to independence had himself been a teacher in mission schools, had himself navigated the particular world of institutional colonial education from the inside, carrying within him both the knowledge that those institutions provided and the particular experience of living within their specific demands. This is a detail that sits quietly in the background of the 1962 story, without explaining anything or demanding any particular conclusion. It is simply true, and true in a way that gives the landscape of the story a little more texture, a little more human depth. The lake continued its slow persistence at the edge of all of this, wide and flat, and older than the political arrangements that had been made in its vicinity, older than the mission schools that had been built along its shore, older than the paths that ran between the communities that fished its waters and farmed the red earth behind its shoreline. In the early morning of any day in January 1962, the surface of Lake Victoria would have caught the first light in the same way it always had, the water holding the pale colors of the sky before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the darkness of the night still present in the deeper water farther from shore. The fishermen who went out before dawn would have seen that first light on the water as they had always seen it, the lake offering its familiar combination of beauty and scale and the particular silence of open water before the day begins. The communities around that lake were the communities from which the girls at Kashasha had come, and to which many of them would return when the school year ended or when circumstances required. The school was not separate from those communities. It was connected to them by the movement of its students and the flow of news and the particular kind of distance that both separates and maintains connection, the distance of the path walked and the path that can be walked again, somewhere along one of those paths, in the particular way of things that have a beginning but no obvious moment of beginning. January of 1962 arrived in the Kagera region of a newly independent Tanganyika, with its ordinary weather and its ordinary sounds, and its specific unrepeatable combination of circumstances already assembled and waiting. The lake was wide, the paths were red, the hills rolled quietly toward the water in the early light. Nair had taken office 6 weeks before, a school teacher carrying the particular knowledge of what it meant to live and work inside the educational institutions of his country, and now leading a nation that was finding its way into its first uncertain year of being something new. The world of the Kagera region in January 1962 had its ordinary texture and its specific history, its dense social fabric, and its characteristic ways of carrying the news of unusual things from place to place along the paths that connected everyone to everyone else. And the lake at the center of it all held its color and its quiet and its complete indifference to the particular human dramas assembled along its shore. A girl stepped through the school gates and onto the road, and the dust came up around her feet the way it always did on that stretch between the mission grounds and the first bend in the path, heading south toward Nshamba. Her bundle was balanced on her head, the rolled cloth and the few belongings she had kept with her at the school, and the weight of it was familiar, the kind of familiar that comes from a journey made before, from knowing exactly how far you can go before you need to shift the load. The road ahead of her was red-earthed and open. The hills on either side were low and covered in the dry season grass that had gone the color of old paper. Behind her, the school gate stood wide. It was March, and the air had the particular quality of the early dry season in the Kagera region. Not hot yet in the way that the later months would become, but drying steadily, the moisture leaving the soil gradually the way it does in places that are accustomed to it. The road from the school toward Nanjamba ran roughly south, passing through stretches of open ground and then narrowing between taller vegetation where the path had been worn deep over many years of foot travel. She was not the only one on it. Other girls from the school had left that same morning, some going in different directions, following the various paths back to the villages their families came from. The road toward Nshamba carried a few of them, not walking together exactly, but close enough that they remained within sight of each other for most of the way. The distance from the school to Nshamba was the kind of distance that a person measures in hours rather than miles. On that road in that season, with the bundle balanced and the dust rising and settling, the journey would have taken most of a morning or most of an afternoon, depending on when you started and whether you stopped. The girls who walked it that day in March of 1962 were carrying the ordinary things a person carries home from a long stay away: their clothing, their few school materials, the accumulated small objects of months lived in a place, and they were also carrying, though this would not have been the frame anyone used at the time, the memory of what had happened inside the school walls they had just left, the laughter, the weeks of it, The teachers standing in the doorways, and the beds in the dormitories occupied by students who could not stop, and the slow accumulation of days in which the school had become a place that no longer worked the way a school was supposed to work. When a person walks away from something unusual and returns to the ordinary life that came before it, there is often a period in which the unusual thing recedes and the ordinary reasserts itself. The red earth of the road, the smell of the grass, the specific light of a mid-morning in early dry season. These things are real and continuous, and they have the steadying quality of the familiar. And for a time, walking that road south toward Nashamba, the school and everything that had happened inside it might have seemed like something that was being left behind. It was not. What arrived in Nashamba arrived with the students who walked there from the school. And what arrived was not an object or a substance, but something that moved differently from either, something that required, in order to move, the particular proximity of people who shared a world with each other. In Shamba, approximately 217 people would eventually be affected. That number, gathered from the records assembled later by investigators who came to the region to understand what was happening, stands as one of the largest single community clusters outside the school where the episodes had originated. It is a large number for a village. It means that in a community where most people would have known most other people by name, and where households sat close enough together that sound carried between them in the evenings, a significant portion of the population came to experience what the students at the school had experienced. The way it arrived in Nashamba was the way things have always arrived in places connected to each other by footpaths and family ties. News traveled those roads before anything else did. A girl arrived home, and the first things exchanged were the ordinary ones: the greeting, the recognition, the setting down of the bundle, and then at some point, the account of what had happened at the school. The laughter that had started with 3 girls and spread to include dozens more. The teachers who had tried to stop it and could not. The weeks of disrupted schedules. The final closure. Word of this traveled through Nashamba in the way word travels through any close-knit community, passed between households and along paths, arriving at ears that had not yet heard it, and settling there, carrying its particular strangeness with it. In communities connected the way the Kagera region communities were connected, through market days, through the movement of family members between compounds, through the particular density of relationship that exists in places where multiple generations have lived within walking distance of each other. News of something unusual does not stay contained, it moves, and something else appears to have moved with it, or close behind it, or alongside it in a way that is difficult to describe, precisely because what was moving was not a thing that can be carried in a bundle or passed hand to hand. The episodes of uncontrollable laughter began in Nashamba. People who had not been anywhere near the school, who had never sat in its classrooms or slept in its dormitories, found themselves in the same condition the school's students had described. The laughter that comes and does not stop when expected to stop, the crying that sometimes follows or alternates with it, the physical discomfort that arrives alongside. The community at Nshamba, having heard what had happened at the school before the episodes began there, would have had the particular experience of watching something arrive that they had already, in a sense, been told was coming. The news had been a kind of forerunner. That is one of the quietly interesting features of the way the epidemic moved through the Kagera region. In most outbreaks of illness spread by biological agents, people in affected communities know something is happening because they or the people around them become sick. The information and the condition arrive roughly together, or the condition arrives first and the information follows. In the Kagera region, In 1962, the information often moved ahead of the condition itself, carried along the social roads by word of mouth, arriving in a village days before any resident of that village began to show symptoms. The news of what had happened at Kashasha School traveled south and east and west through the region's communication networks, and those networks, by the standard of what was available in that place in that year, were effective ones. Bukoba, the regional town situated a manageable distance from Kashasha along the Lakeshore Road, served as a kind of hub for the movement of people and news through the wider Kagera region. On market days, which drew traders and farmers and buyers from the surrounding villages along the red laterite roads, conversation carried what newspapers and radio broadcasts carried in other places and other times. A piece of news originating in a school near the lake shore would find its way to Bukoba, and from Bukoba it would find its way along the roads leading outward to the villages and smaller settlements that made up the region's scattered population. A man returning from a market day, or a woman who had spent the morning at a gathering and then walked home in the afternoon, might carry the account of something heard from someone who had heard it from someone else, the original event becoming a story that others held and passed on. Near Bukoba, at the Ramashinye Girls' Middle School, the account of what had happened at Kashasha appears to have arrived before the condition did. The school was close enough to the town to be part of its social world, and the social world of Bukoba in March and April of 1962 was one in which the events at Kashasha were very much a subject of conversation. The Ramashinye School was a girls' school like Kashasha, its students living in the same kind of institutional setting, dormitories, and schedules, and communal meals, and the daily routines of a boarding school governed by rules that had been designed for a different world and applied to this one. When the laughter began at Ramashinye, the pattern was familiar to anyone who had heard the accounts from Kashasha. Uncontrollable episodes, crying following or alternating with the laughter, students unable to return to the ordinary functioning of classroom life, physical complaints alongside the more visible symptoms, administrators attempting the same interventions the Kashasha staff had attempted, separation, appeals to composure, the firm voice in the doorway, and finding them equally ineffective. At Ramashinye, as at Kashasha, the eventual response was closure. The school could not continue to function as a school when a significant portion of its students were in the grip of episodes that no one could explain and no one had found a way to stop. Closure was the practical decision, and it was made, as it had been made at Kashasha, with the expectation that it was a temporary measure, that the students would return home, rest, recover, and that the school could resume. And some of what was expected did happen. Students did return home, and they did recover over time, and the schools did eventually reopen. What the expectation had not fully accounted for was the movement that closure set in motion, the way students dispersed into the wider network of villages and communities and carried with them something that continued in those communities to do what it had done at the schools. The Kanyangareka school followed the same arc, an outbreak among students. The particular incapacity that results when a large portion of a school's population is experiencing recurring episodes that no standard intervention can interrupt. The administration reaching the same conclusion that Kashasha and Ramashinye had reached before it, and finding the gates open and the students walking the roads toward their home villages, and those villages receiving them. The pattern had by now been established clearly enough that investigators who arrived in the region to examine what was happening had an outline to follow: school, outbreak, closure, dispersal, community cases, and they found it repeated, with local variations, across each of the documented sites. A hand-drawn map of the Kagera region, marked with small circles at each of the places where cases had been recorded, would have looked nothing like the maps that epidemiologists associate with illnesses spread through the air or water or the contact of hands. Those maps tend to show clusters that radiate outward from a point of origin in rough circles, or that follow water courses, or that mark density of population without much regard for the specific social connections between individuals. The map of the 1962 Kagera region epidemic would have looked different. Its circles would have followed lines, the lines of the roads, the paths between school and home village, the route between one village and another that was connected by market day travel or family relationship. The geography of the outbreak was a social geography, shaped by the bonds and movements of the people it passed among, rather than by wind direction or water supply. From Kashasha to Nshamba, following the road south. From Kashasha and Nshamba outward to other communities whose names appear in the records assembled by investigators, places that were part of the same social world, connected by the same kinship networks and market routes and school relationships that structured life in the Kagera region. From those communities to Ramashenya and the schools near Bukoba, following the paths that students and their families traveled to town. From the schools near Bukoba, outward again, as those schools closed and their students walked home. Each point of dispersal became a new point of origin, not because anyone intended it to, but because the condition moved along the particular channels that human connection had built across the landscape over many generations. The total number of people affected across all documented sites, Kashasha, Nshamba, Ramashenye, Kanyangereka, and the additional village communities whose cases were recorded by investigators, falls somewhere between 1,000 and a higher figure that becomes harder to pin down precisely when the less formally documented community cases are included. 1,000 is a number that deserves a moment to settle. In a region like the Kagera, connected by footpaths and market days, and the slow movement of information through social networks, 1,000 people experiencing the same condition over 18 months represents something that reached into communities at every scale, into schools and villages and family compounds, into the everyday life of a place that was not expecting to become the location of anything unusual. The 18 months themselves are worth holding in mind. From January 1962, when the episodes began at Kashasha, to the gradual resolution that investigators and community members noted as the year 1963 moved through its seasons, the epidemic persisted across a span of time that encompasses the full cycle of agricultural seasons in the Kagera region, the dry period and the rains returning, and the dry period coming again. During those 18 months, the schools in the region were disrupted, reopened in some cases, closed again in others, with administrators and medical staff and community leaders working through a situation that none of their existing frameworks had prepared them for. A village elder in Nshamba receiving the first returning students from the closed school and hearing their account of what had happened inside its walls, and then watching in the days that followed as members of her own community began to experience similar episodes. That sequence of events would have had a particular quality to it. The news arriving first, the condition following the news, the familiar faces of neighbors and family members entering states that were recognizable from the description, but no less bewildering for being described in advance. The interventions that a community would reach for, the remedies for ordinary illness, the consultation with those who knew how to address unusual afflictions, the particular kind of collective attention that a community brings to something that is happening to its members and that it does not fully understand. These were applied in various forms in the communities of the Kagera region during 1962 and into 1963. What the epidemic met in those communities was not indifference. The people it affected were surrounded by others who cared about them and who were attempting, with the tools and frameworks available to them, to address what was happening. This is a point worth resting on because it is easy, reading about an event across a distance of more than 60 years, to see the affected communities as the passive location of something happening to them. They were not. They were active, engaged, and attempting, as anyone would, to make sense of something genuinely puzzling and to help the people in front of them who were in evident distress. The distress was real. However, the epidemic is classified, and whatever mechanisms are eventually agreed upon to explain it. The experience of being unable to control one's own laughter, of having it shift into crying, of feeling pain in the chest or the abdomen, alongside something that looks, from the outside, like nothing more than uncontrollable amusement. That experience belonged to real people in real communities who had not asked for it and who were trying to get through it. The communities that received the returning students from Kashasha and then found their own members affected were communities in which ordinary life continued to need attending to. The fields, the children, the fishnets, the market day preparations. An epidemic that took people out of the ordinary functioning of daily life for days or weeks at a time was not a neutral event for those communities. It had weight. Along the road between Kashasha and Bukoba, in the early dry season of 1962, the movement of people carried more than the usual freight of daily life. The traders with their goods, the farmers traveling to market, the students walking home from closed schools, all of these were part of the social circulation that the region depended on, and it was within that circulation that the epidemic found its roots. The road itself was a plain thing, red earth compacted by years of foot traffic, edged with grass that browned as the dry season deepened, running through the low hills and the open ground in the particular unhurried way of paths that have been used for a long time and expect to be used for a long time more. A few figures moving along that road in the afternoon heat, in the particular way that people move when they have a destination in mind, and the distance to it is familiar, not hurrying, but not dawdling, the pace of someone who knows how long the journey takes and has calibrated their steps accordingly. They were carrying with them, in the way that humans always carry things between places, the news of the world they had just left, and the news of the world they were returning to, and the invisible freight of shared experience that moves between people without being loaded onto anyone's back. The epidemic reached its geographic limits somewhere within a radius of roughly 100 miles from Kashasha, a distance that, measured in foot travel, represents the outer edge of the social network that connected the Kagera region communities to each other. Beyond that radius, the connections thinned, the routes of travel grew less frequent, the shared institutional and community bonds that had carried the condition from place to place were no longer dense enough to sustain the movement. The epidemic did not simply fade everywhere at once. It wound down the way things wind down in social networks, gradually, unevenly, with some places resolving before others, the final cases appearing in communities where the threads connecting them to the earlier sites had only recently been pulled taut. By 1963, the region was quiet again, in the particular way that places return to quiet after something unusual has passed through them. The schools reopened. The students returned to their dormitories and their classrooms and the daily schedules of institutional education. The communities in Shamba and the other affected villages resumed the ordinary rhythms of agricultural and market life. The investigators who had come to the region to examine the outbreak had gathered their notes and their records and their systematic accounts of symptoms and dates and affected individuals, and had begun the work of writing down what they had found, which was, among other things, that what had happened was real and large and unlike anything their existing frameworks made easy to describe. The road between Kashasha and Shamba, between Kashasha and Bukoba, between each of the affected communities and the next, those roads continued to be traveled after 1963 in the same way they had been traveled before 1962. Feet on red earth, bundles balanced, the low hills on either side, the lake visible on the clearest days and from the higher ground as a brightness somewhere to the north, wide and flat, and there the paths did not record what had passed along them. They simply continued to be paths, used by the communities they connected for all the purposes paths are used for: the carrying of goods, the visiting of family, the attendance at markets and schools and gatherings, the ordinary daily movement that keeps a region's social world alive and connected and in circulation. What had moved along those paths in 1962 and into 1963 had been something that moved only through that kind of connection, the kind built from shared meals and shared dormitories and shared institutional pressures and shared membership in communities that knew each other's names. It had traveled the roads that people traveled because people were the only vehicle it had, and it had reached in the end as far as those human roads extended into the landscape of the Kagareba region, roughly 100 miles in radius, across 18 months, among a population spread across schools and villages, and the red-earthed paths that ran between them. That is a considerable distance for something to travel without a body of its own. It is the distance of human connection in a particular place in a particular year, measured not in kilometers, but in the density of relationship and the frequency of contact, and the specific social bonds that make one community part of the world of another. Following those bonds, moving along those lines of connection, the epidemic had made itself a map of the Kagera region's social geography, and left, in the records assembled by the investigators who came afterward, a precise and unusually clear picture of how far in that place and that time one community reached into the next. The school at Kashasha sat near the lake. The roads ran south and east and west from it through the low hills. Along those roads, in the months between March 1962 and the gradual quieting of 1963, something moved that was neither wind nor water nor the passage of any biological agent the investigators could find. It moved the way news moves, and the way memory moves, and the way the particular mood of a shared situation passes among people who are in it together. It moved along the lines of human relationship, following the paths that people walked, and it reached as far as those paths went before the connections grew thin enough to stop it. And then, having traveled the full extent of the social world it had found its way into, it settled. A medical investigator sits at a low table somewhere in the Kagera region, in the particular flat light of a morning that has already grown warm. His notebook is open to a fresh page. The girl across from him has been laughing, on and off, for 3 days. She is not laughing now. She is sitting quietly with her hands in her lap, looking at a point somewhere past his left shoulder, and she looks tired in the way that people look when their bodies have been doing something without their permission for longer than seems possible. He asks her where the pain is. She places one hand flat against her ribs, just below the sternum. He writes this down. He asks her when it began. She tells him. He writes that down too. Then he writes the word laughter, and beneath it crying, and beneath that chest, and beneath that rash, and he sits for a moment looking at this small column of words, as though expecting them to arrange themselves into something that makes a coherent kind of sense. What the medical investigators documented across the weeks they spent moving through the affected villages and schools of the Kagera region in 1962 was a set of symptoms that turned out to be more varied and more physically concrete than a simple description of the outbreak might suggest. The laughter was the most visible feature, the one that traveled most readily in accounts and word of mouth, the one that gave the episode its name in the historical record. But it was not the only thing happening to the people who were affected, and for many of them it was not even the most difficult thing. Alongside the laughter, medical staff recorded episodes of uncontrollable crying, sometimes following the laughter, sometimes alternating with it, sometimes arriving on its own. A girl who had been laughing for an hour might find the laughter shifting, the sound changing quality, becoming something that sounded more like grief than amusement, the distinction between the two becoming unclear even to those watching. The same body that had been shaking with laughter was now shaking with something else, and the person inside that body had no more control over one than over the other. Investigators wrote both down. Neither one was chosen. Fainting was also documented across multiple sites. Not fainting in the mild, ordinary sense of a person feeling lightheaded and sitting down, but episodes in which individuals lost consciousness, were caught or supported by others nearby, and came around some time later, sometimes into a new round of the laughter, and sometimes into a quieter state of exhaustion. The episodes of fainting appeared more often at the height of a prolonged episode than at its beginning, as though the body's resources had been drawn down by the sustained effort of uncontrolled symptoms over hours or days. A girl who had been through a long episode and then fainted and then come around again was by any ordinary measure tired. The people around her were, in their own way, tired too. Skin rashes were among the more unexpected entries in the investigative record. Rashes appeared on a number of affected individuals in patterns that varied from person to person, in some cases across the arms, in some cases on the torso, in some cases on the face. The rashes were real and visible. They were examined, recorded, and in some cases sketched into the medical notebooks, laboratory tests designed to identify known causes, bacterial infection, viral illness, contact with irritants, parasitic conditions, returned no explanations for them. The rashes existed. Their origin within the framework of biological medicine could not be established. The investigators noted this and continued. In some of the more prolonged or intense episodes, individuals also experienced what was described as respiratory difficulty, a laboring of the breath, a sense of tightness, a quality to the breathing that those watching described as distress. The laughter itself, sustained for long periods, changes the mechanics of breathing considerably, requiring rapid and often shallow breaths that over time can produce genuine physical strain. Whether the respiratory symptoms arose from the sustained physical effort of the laughing episodes, or whether they were part of a broader pattern of physiological response, was not something the 1962 investigators could settle with certainty. Both possibilities were noted. The entries in the notebooks continued to accumulate. What becomes clear, reading across these documented symptoms, is that the people who were affected were not merely laughing. They were experiencing something that moved through several registers of physical expression: laughter, tears, collapse, skin response, respiratory change, in a way that resisted easy summary and resisted equally easy dismissal. The investigators did not dismiss it. They wrote it down carefully. in the slightly faded ink of field notebooks kept in warm and humid conditions, and what they recorded was the picture of real bodies doing things their inhabitants had not asked them to do, and doing them persistently across days that must have felt very long indeed. The question of duration was one of the more striking features in the investigative record. Some affected individuals recovered within a few hours. The episode arrived, lasted, and subsided, and the person returned to their ordinary day with a particular kind of exhausted puzzlement, and, in many cases, no clear memory of having felt anything that could explain what the laughter had been about. These shorter episodes were common enough that they might, in isolation, have seemed almost unremarkable, a strange afternoon, a recoverable afternoon, the sort of thing that becomes a quietly unusual memory in a largely ordinary life. Other cases were considerably longer. The investigative record documented cases in which the symptoms, the cycles of laughter, crying, fatigue, and physical pain persisted for days. Not a single long afternoon, but several full days of recurring episodes, the person moving through them in a condition of ongoing disruption that interrupted sleep, appetite, and the basic maintenance of daily life. A girl who had been experiencing episodes for 4 days, or 6 days, or 8 days, was living, across that stretch of time, inside a state that was genuinely demanding to endure. The people around her, family members, teachers, other students, were living alongside it, watching it, managing their own responses to watching it. The most extreme documented cases were those in which the symptoms persisted for something approaching 2 weeks or more. 16 days appears in the record as one of the outer limits of individual episode duration, 16 days of recurring symptoms before a return to an ordinary baseline state. 16 days is a long time to be inside a body that is not behaving as bodies generally should. For most affected individuals who recovered, the recovery came fully and left no permanent physical trace. The symptoms, however long they lasted, did not produce lasting physiological damage. The investigators noted this with something that reads, at a little distance, like relief. Pain was another feature of the documented record that received careful attention from investigators, and that deserves careful attention now because it points towards something important about the nature of what was happening in the Kagera region in 1962. Pain is easy to imagine in a case involving uncontrollable laughter as a peripheral concern, a secondary discomfort, perhaps, arising from the sustained physical effort of the laughing itself, the strained muscles, and tired diaphragm that might result from any prolonged and vigorous bodily activity. The investigative record does not support this minimal interpretation. Affected individuals reported pain that was genuine, located, specific, and at times severe. Abdominal pain was among the most commonly reported, a pain in the stomach and lower torso that individuals described not as a vague discomfort, but as something that demanded attention, that changed the way they held their bodies, that was present between episodes as well as during them. Chest tightness was also reported, a physical sensation in the chest that individuals described in terms that medical staff took seriously, recording it as a symptom rather than categorizing it as secondary to the main presentation. General body aching, a kind of pervasive physical tiredness that settled into the muscles and limbs, was noted across multiple cases as a feature that persisted into the quieter intervals between active episodes. The investigators examining these individuals did something important with this information. They took it seriously. They did not conclude, because laboratory tests were returning no biological explanations, that the pain was therefore not real, or that the individuals reporting it were exaggerating, or that the physical experience of the affected students was somehow less valid because it appeared to arise from psychological and social causes rather than from a bacterium or a virus or an identified toxin. The pain was documented as a real physiological effect because that is what it was. The fact that the mechanism producing it was unusual did not make the pain itself less concrete, less felt, or less worthy of the column of careful notation in a field investigator's notebook. This careful, plain-faced recording of real physical effects produced by a non-biological cause is part of what makes the 1962 Kagura investigation valuable as a historical document. The investigators were not trying to prove a theory, they were trying to describe accurately what they found. And what they found was a population of people experiencing genuine physical symptoms in the absence of a biological agent, which by the standards of 19th century medicine, and even much of 20th century medicine, was a genuinely difficult category of phenomenon to hold in mind without either dismissing it or dramatizing it. The investigators, by the record they left, appear to have done neither. The student lying on a cot in the school infirmary, her breathing shallow, her eyes open to the ceiling, the worst of the morning's episode having finally quieted, is the clearest image the record offers of what these weeks were like at the level of the individual body. A cloth folded and dampened with water, placed across her forehead by someone who understood that this was not a cure, but was something. The particular texture of an exhaustion that goes deeper than ordinary tiredness, down into the kind of depletion that follows sustained, involuntary physical effort. The stillness of the room around her, the distant sound of other students, some of them perhaps in their own episodes, some of them perhaps in their own brief intervals of quiet. The ordinary afternoon continuing outside the infirmary window, the light moving across the red earth of the school grounds in the slow way that light moves across open ground in the early afternoon dry season. Recovery, when it came, was full. The record is consistent on this point across the cases investigators had access to. An individual who had been experiencing episodes for 11 days would wake on the 12th morning in a condition that differed from the preceding 11 days, in a way that was immediately noticeable, not to her alone, but to anyone who had been watching. The episodes were gone. Not reduced, not intermittent, but gone. The body that had spent nearly 2 weeks doing something its inhabitant had not asked it to do, had simply stopped. The girl who had been inside that experience would sit up slowly, look out through the doorway at whatever ordinary morning was presenting itself, and find herself return to her ordinary self with a thoroughness that must have been, after 11 days, its own strange relief. The investigators noted a pattern in recovery that reinforced what they were beginning to observe about the broader structure of the epidemic. In case after case, removal from the affected social environment was associated with recovery. Students taken away from the school or separated from the group of students who were symptomatic tended to improve. Students who remained in close daily contact with those still experiencing episodes tended to remain symptomatic for longer. This pattern held across multiple sites. It was not perfect. Not every separation produced immediate recovery, and not every student who remained in contact with symptomatic peers became affected or remained so indefinitely. But the tendency was clear enough, across enough cases, to become part of the investigator's understanding of how the condition spread and how it resolved. This understanding that the condition was associated with the social environment rather than with any individual biological exposure was the investigative finding that did the most to orient the subsequent analysis. It pointed toward a kind of contagion that operated through different channels than the ones medicine was most familiar with in 1962. Not a bacterium moving through shared water or food, not a virus passing through the air. Something that moved through the particular connections between people who shared an identity, a daily life, a set of pressures, and a social world that had been producing its particular conditions for some time before January of that year. The demographic pattern of who was affected in the Kagera epidemic is one of the most frequently noted features in the historical and academic record, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment before moving on, because it is genuinely informative about what was happening in those schools and villages in 1962. The outbreak at Kishasha affected students. The spread to Nashamba affected residents of that village. The outbreaks at other affected schools affected the students enrolled in those schools. Across all documented cases, the affected population was overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly young, and overwhelmingly living in the kind of institutional boarding school environment in which adolescent girls were gathered from their home communities, required to live under institutional rules, and expected to perform academically and behaviorally according to standards derived from a social context quite different from their own. Girls between the ages of 10 and 18 were the population most consistently represented among the affected across all sites. Young women slightly above that age range were also represented, particularly in the village-level outbreaks, though typically with less severe or less prolonged symptoms. Adult women in the surrounding communities were affected in some cases, adding to the total number of individuals the epidemic reached, but their reported episodes tended to differ in severity from those of the students at the institutional schools. Boys were rarely, if ever, among those documented as experiencing the laughter episodes. Men in the surrounding communities were similarly absent from the affected population in any consistent way. The boarding school environment deserves particular attention as the setting in which the most severe and prolonged cases occurred. Girls attending these mission schools had left their home villages and family compounds to live within institutions governed by rules and expectations that differed considerably from what they had known. The daily schedule was structured by external authority. The language of instruction was formal Swahili, or English rather than the home language each girl had grown up speaking. Religious observance was required and performed within a framework that derived from Christian missionary tradition rather than from the spiritual practices of the surrounding communities. Academic performance was assessed by formal examination in a context in which the stakes of that performance had real implications for the future lives of girls who were among the first in their communities to have access to formal schooling at all. This was not an environment of ease. It was an environment of significant and sustained demand, operating on adolescent girls who were living away from their families, navigating institutional hierarchies that were not their own, and carrying a set of expectations, social, academic, religious, familial, that did not always sit in comfortable alignment with one another. The particular texture of that daily pressure is not always easy to reconstruct from the available record, but the record of who was affected and how severely and where suggests that the institutional boarding school was an environment in which something had been accumulating for some time before January of 1962, accumulating quietly in the bodies and the social bonds of the girls who lived there, in the way that pressure accumulates in any enclosed and demanding situation before it finds an outlet of some kind. The village cases, arriving in the weeks after the school closures, showed a somewhat different demographic profile. In Nashamba and the other communities that became affected following the return of students from closed schools, The affected individuals included adults as well as adolescents, women of a wider age range, community members who had not been inside the school system at all, but who were connected through family bonds, through proximity, through the daily social fabric of village life, to those who had been. The symptoms in these community cases were reported as generally milder and shorter in duration, though still real and still disruptive in the lives of the people who experienced them. The epidemic, as it moved outward from the institutional settings into the wider social world, changed somewhat in character, the intensity of the episodes moderating as the particular pressure of the boarding school environment gave way to the different and less enclosed pressures of community life. The pattern of who was not affected is in some ways as informative as the pattern of who was. The investigative record is consistent across multiple sites in documenting that European missionaries and the African teachers and other adult supervisors working directly with affected students did not themselves develop symptoms. This was not a matter of these individuals being physically removed from the environment where the episodes were occurring. Many of them were present daily in the same classrooms, dormitories, and school grounds where students were affected. They interacted with symptomatic students throughout the course of the outbreaks. They were as physically present to whatever was circulating in those environments as anyone else in those buildings, and yet they were not affected. Not one missionary teacher in the record, not one adult supervisor who occupied the institutional role of authority figure over the affected student population. The line between the affected and the unaffected, at every site, investigators examined closely, ran not along a boundary of physical location or biological exposure, but along a boundary of social identity and institutional role. The students were inside the condition. The supervisors were outside it. The air between them, in the specific physical sense of a pathogen moving through a shared environment, was the same air. The social distance between them, measured in hierarchy and role and institutional power, was considerable. A dormitory room at one of the affected schools, in the later weeks of the outbreak, would have presented a particular kind of picture. 2/3 of the beds, perhaps, occupied by students in various stages of their episodes, some in the midst of active laughter or tears, some in the exhausted quiet of an interval between episodes, some newly begun, and some days into an experience that had already significantly disrupted their ordinary existence. The remaining beds belonging to the dormitory's senior supervising adult left undisturbed, the adult herself standing in the doorway, unaffected, watching, doing what she could within the limits of what the situation permitted, which was, as the investigator's record confirms, not very much. Separation of individuals, appeals to composure, practical care where it could be offered, none of it stopping what was already in motion. What the investigators were looking at in that dormitory doorway scene was a set of circumstances that did not fit neatly into the explanatory frameworks that 1962 medicine had most readily available. A biological agent spreads to anyone biologically susceptible. An environmental toxin affects everyone in the environment. A shared physiological vulnerability expresses itself without reference to social role. None of these models produced a picture consistent with what the investigators were finding, a condition that moved with precision along lines of shared social identity and common stress exposure that affected the girls inside a particular institutional world and left the adults governing that world untouched, that traveled outward from schools into communities along the routes of human connection and relationship. The investigators noted all of this carefully. They continued writing in their notebooks, the entries accumulated. The picture that emerged from those entries was not a tidy one, but it was a genuine one, a detailed, field-observed account of real people in a real place experiencing real symptoms whose mechanism was, at that point, genuinely open. The investigators who arrived in the Kagera region in 1962 were not operating with the analytical vocabulary that later researchers would bring to the Tanganyika case. They were working with what they had, which was a notebook, a willingness to record what they saw honestly, and the professional discipline to avoid reaching for an explanation that the evidence did not support, simply because the evidence was demanding and the question was uncomfortable. What the girl in Nashamba experienced on the morning the episodes finally stopped is not in the record in any particular way. The record keeps what is measurable: dates, duration, symptom categories, demographic notes. It does not typically keep the texture of a specific morning, the specific quality of light, the particular feeling of waking into a body that has returned to being unremarkable. But the investigative record does confirm that recovery happened, that it was complete, and that it arrived, for most of those affected, in the specific context of removal from the social environment in which the symptoms had developed. A girl taken home from a closed school, a girl who stayed home. The symptoms resolving not because any medical treatment had addressed them, but because the particular conditions in which they had developed were no longer present in the same concentrated form. She might have sat up slowly on that morning, looked at the light in the doorway, listened to the ordinary sounds of the compound, a cook fire, a voice calling from another part of the house, the distant general sound of the waking village, and found that they were simply those things, without the quality of unreality that sustained episodes seem to produce, without the particular background register of dread that comes with inhabiting a body that has stopped being predictable, ordinary, the simplest possible relief, the specific pleasant flatness of an ordinary morning after a morning that was not. The record of the 1962 Kagera epidemic is in this sense a record of people moving through something genuinely unusual and coming out the other side of it largely intact. The symptoms were real and demanding. The duration was real and exhausting. The uncertainty for the affected individuals, for their families, for the investigators trying to understand what they were looking at, was also real, and probably not easy to live inside, but the bodies recovered. The episodes resolved. The girls who had spent days inside the uncontrolled laughter and crying and pain woke up on particular mornings in particular villages and found the episodes were simply gone and the ordinary business of their lives resumed. This is the most complete picture the investigative record allows, not a picture of disaster, but a picture of disruption, unusually prolonged and unusually distributed, affecting a specific population in a specific region at a specific and particular historical moment, resolving in a way that confirmed to those who looked carefully at its structure that whatever was moving through the schools and villages of the Kagera region in 1962 was moving along the channels of social connection and shared experience rather than through any route that biological medicine would have recognized as the ordinary path of contagion. The medical investigator who sat across from the girl with her hand against her ribs in the warm flat light of a Kagera morning did not have a full explanation to offer her. He had his notebook and his column of carefully written words and the professional discipline to write down what was real rather than what was convenient. He wrote down laughter. He wrote down crying. He wrote down chest and rash and pain. He wrote down 3 days. He wrote down age, and beside it, the number she gave him, a number in the particular range that appeared across the entries in his notebook with a consistency that was, by this point in the investigation, no longer a coincidence to him, but was becoming a pattern, a question, a thread in the record that would need to be followed somewhere. It had not yet been followed. The girl sitting across from him did not choose any of what had happened to her body across those 3 days. She had not decided to laugh. She had not decided to cry. She had not decided to have her chest tighten or her skin respond. She was, in the most literal sense, a person to whom something had happened, something that had moved into her through channels she had not been aware of, and that had expressed itself through the particular body she happened to inhabit, in the particular school she happened to attend, in the particular weeks she happened to be living through, in the particular year of a world that was itself in the middle of becoming something new. The investigator wrote this down too, in his way. The entries in the notebook accumulated. The girl, after some time, recovered. The notebook remained. What the investigator could not have known in that warm morning room in 1962 was that his careful entries would become part of a historical record read by researchers decades later, used to anchor an analysis that would place the Tanganyika case among the most thoroughly documented examples of its particular type of phenomenon in the entire 20th century. He was simply doing the work in front of him, which was to sit with a girl who had been inside something genuinely unusual for 3 days, and write down what she told him about where the pain was, and continue asking questions for as long as she had answers to give, and record it all honestly in a column of words that was, by the standards of 1962, the best available instrument for describing something that the instruments of 1962 had not quite been built to describe. The adults at the affected schools who stood in the dormitory doorways without developing symptoms themselves did not understand why they were not affected in those weeks any more than the affected students understood why they were. The fact was simply visible in the record, the students inside the episodes, the supervisors outside them, the same air in the building, the same days, the same meals, the same bells rung at the same hours, the same institutional world operating around both groups simultaneously. Whatever passed between the students in those weeks did not pass across the particular distance between those who were supervised and those who supervised them. The investigators noted this with the same careful plainness they brought to everything else. The entries in the notebooks continued to accumulate, the picture continued to develop, and the girl across from the investigator, with her hand flat against her ribs and the morning light on her face, and the 3 difficult days sitting somewhere in the recent past that her body had not yet fully let go of, waited patiently while he finished writing down what she had told him, and then sat quietly in the particular exhausted stillness of someone who has been through something, and looked out toward the window at the ordinary landscape of the Kagera region, the low hills and the red paths and the distant brightness of the lake on the horizon, the water wide and unhurried and entirely unchanged by whatever had been happening in the buildings and classrooms and dormitories and village compounds that sat in the warm landscape between the school gates and the water's edge. A government medical officer arrived in the Kagera region sometime in the middle months of 1962, carrying a field notebook with a plain cloth cover and a pen tucked into its spine. He sat down at a table in a borrowed room, most likely somewhere near Bukoba, and opened the notebook to a clean page. At the top he wrote the date. Below that, the name of the village. Below that, nothing yet, because the investigation had only just begun, and there was nothing yet to write. That moment of a blank page, with a date at the top and a village name beneath it, is where the formal record begins, not with conclusions, not with findings, with a man writing down where he was and when, before he had understood anything at all about what he had come to see. What followed from that moment? The examinations, the interviews, the careful noting of symptoms and durations and demographic patterns would eventually produce a documented record, extensive enough to serve, decades later, as primary source material for researchers working far from the Kagera region, in universities and libraries, and offices where the lake and the red laterite roads were present only as coordinates on a map. The government medical teams dispatched to the region examined affected individuals systematically, asked questions, recorded answers, and sent the results to the capital, where they were compiled into reports that would outlast the episodes they described. The investigation was methodical. The investigators took the condition seriously. They did not arrive with an explanation already in hand. The first and most pressing question was biological. Before any other interpretation could be considered, the medical teams needed to know whether the outbreak had a biological cause, whether some bacterium or virus or environmental toxin had found its way into the water supply or the food at Kashasha, and whether the school closure had failed to stop its spread because it had already moved into the wider community. The tests run on affected individuals were thorough by the standards available at the time. Blood work, stool samples, examinations for parasitic conditions, assessments for toxic exposure. The results came back the same way across every test category: negative. No bacterial infection was identified. No viral illness matched the symptom profile. No parasitic condition was found. No environmental toxin appeared in any of the samples. The biological explanations, one by one, were examined and set aside. There is something quietly significant in a list of negatives. Each one represents a hypothesis that was taken seriously enough to test, and a result that was clear enough to rule out. The investigators were not dismissing possibilities, they were eliminating them methodically, which is a different thing. By the time the full battery of tests had returned negative results, the investigators were left not with nothing, but with a more precise question. Whatever was moving through the communities of the Kagera region, it was not moving through biological channels. It was not in the water, not in shared food, not on surfaces, not in the air. The condition spread through pathways that biological testing could not detect, which meant the pathways were social. That conclusion, that the outbreak had spread through psychological and social mechanisms rather than through any biological agent, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as the remaining possibility once the others had been cleared away. The investigators wrote it into their reports in the measured language of official documentation. The government filed the reports. The copies were made and distributed and eventually archived. Decades passed. A researcher at Purdue University named Christian Hempelman, whose academic work concerned itself with the psychology of laughter, its mechanisms, its social functions, the conditions under which it operates outside normal voluntary control, came across the documentation of the 1962 outbreak and examined it in sustained detail. What he found in those archived reports was a case that had been carefully recorded at the time of its occurrence, a case with specific dates and locations and symptom profiles and demographic patterns, and a case that had never been given a comprehensive formal analysis in academic literature. He provided one. Hempelman's analysis characterized the 1962 epidemic within the framework of mass psychogenic illness. The term is a careful one. It does not mean the symptoms were not real. It does not mean the affected individuals were performing or exaggerating. The physical pain that affected students described, the abdominal aching, the chest tightness, the exhaustion that followed prolonged episodes, was documented by examining physicians who found no biological cause for it, but who also recorded it as genuine and present. The symptoms were real. What was psychogenic was their origin. They arose not from a pathogen or a toxin, but from psychological and social conditions that found expression through the body in ways that spread from person to person through the channels of shared experience and close social contact. The term mass psychogenic illness had itself gone through some revision by the time Hempelman was writing. Earlier literature often used the phrase mass hysteria, a term with a longer history and considerably more baggage. The word hysteria derives from the Greek word for uterus, carrying within it a centuries-old assumption that this kind of collective episode was primarily a condition of women and girls, and that assumption had been embedded in the diagnostic language long enough to color the way the episodes were described and received. Many researchers in recent decades had moved toward the alternative term mass sociogenic illness, which shifts the emphasis from the individual's psychology to the social environment in which the episodes arise. The social conditions matter. The shared stress, the common institutional context, the lines of identification and trust running between people who live in close proximity. These are not background noise. They are the medium through which the condition travels. The 1962 Kashasha outbreak and the wider epidemic it seeded across the Kagera region is classified in the scientific literature as one of the most geographically extensive and well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness recorded in the 20th century. That designation carries specific weight, not the most dramatic, not the most extreme, but among the most carefully documented, meaning the evidentiary record is reliable enough to support serious analysis, and the geographic scale of the spread was large enough to reveal patterns that a more contained episode might not show. The affected population spread across something in the range of 100 miles of the region, following the paths of human movement rather than diffusing outward in any biological pattern, and the documentation tracked it across multiple communities and institutions over 18 months. That is an unusually complete record. When researchers place the 1962 epidemic in the wider history of collective psychogenic episodes, the comparison that comes up most consistently is the dancing plague of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The two events are separated by more than 400 years and by the entire cultural and historical distance between 16th century Alsace and 20th century East Africa, yet the structural resemblance between them is close enough that historians and psychologists use them together as paired examples of a consistent human pattern. In Strasbourg, beginning in July of 1518, a woman began dancing in the street and could not stop. Within days, others had joined her. Within weeks, the accounts of the time describe hundreds of people dancing without pause or rest in the summer heat, some of them for days at a stretch, some of them collapsing from exhaustion. Physicians brought in to assess the situation concluded that the dancing was caused by overheated blood and recommended more dancing as a cure, a recommendation that was acted on, with stages built and musicians hired to provide accompaniment, before the episode gradually subsided over the course of several weeks. The Strasbourg outbreak occurred in a city that had been under sustained pressure from famine and epidemic disease in the years immediately preceding the summer of 1518. The population had experienced real grinding hardship. The city's religious and civic institutions were under strain. The dancing plague arose in that environment of collective stress and spread through the social fabric of a community bound together by shared difficulty. The 1962 outbreak arose in a community navigating the social and institutional pressures of a specific historical moment, the transition from colonial administration to independence, the demands of mission schooling on adolescent girls removed from their home communities, the particular psychological weight of living under institutional rules in a period of collective change. The surface details are entirely different. The underlying structure, a population under shared pressure, a collective episode that spreads through social channels, a gradual resolution as conditions change, is recognizably the same. Researchers who work on mass psychogenic illness return to these two cases and to others like them, not because the cases prove a single simple theory, but because together they trace something consistent across wildly different cultures and centuries. The human body, under conditions of collective stress and in the context of close social bonds, can produce symptoms that spread from person to person as surely as any physical contagion, and can produce them in ways that affect large numbers of people simultaneously without any biological agent being present. That capacity is documented. It is not mysterious in the sense of being beyond investigation. It is genuinely interesting in the sense of revealing something about how closely the body and its social environment are connected, how the conditions in which a person lives can find expression in the body's own functioning in ways that have little to do with what is measurable in a blood sample. The medical officer in the Kagray region in 1962, sitting at his borrowed table with the notebook open in front of him and the results of the biological tests filed and set aside, would not have used the phrase mass psychogenic illness. The analytical vocabulary that makes the 1962 epidemic legible in a particular way developed over the decades that followed, assembled from multiple cases examined in parallel, from comparisons across historical records, from the slow work of classification that comes after the event has ended and the documentation has been gathered. What he had in that room was a set of observations and a set of tests that had returned negative. What he had was a question written in the space where a biological answer had not appeared. He would have been a careful man to have been assigned to that investigation. He would have recorded what he saw. He would have written the village names and the symptom profiles and the dates and sent the pages to Dar es Salaam and moved on to the next task. The reports outlasted the episodes by decades. They were still there in the archives when the researchers came looking. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that the 1962 epidemic was recorded as thoroughly as it was. Many episodes of this kind in history were not. The dancing plague of Strasbourg is unusually well documented for a 16th century event, but even its record has gaps and ambiguities. The 1962 Tanganyika outbreak benefited from the administrative apparatus of a newly independent nation that had both the institutional will and the practical means to dispatch medical teams and collect formal findings. The investigation was imperfect, conducted under field conditions in a rural region with limited resources, but it was conducted. The record exists because people chose to make it. That record, the field notebooks, the symptom logs, the negative test results, the demographic patterns, the case histories of individuals who experienced episodes for days or weeks and then recovered fully, is what allowed Christian Hempelman and other researchers to reconstruct the epidemic in enough detail to analyze it. It is what allowed the epidemic to enter the formal literature on mass psychogenic illness as a primary case study rather than a rumor or an anecdote. The investigation in that sense was itself part of the story. The affected girls and young women who filled those case histories, whose names and ages and onset dates were recorded in those columns of slightly faded ink, recovered. That is one of the consistent features of mass psychogenic illness. It resolves. The mechanism by which it resolves is not always clear, and the conditions that allow resolution vary, but the documented outcomes of the 1962 epidemic are uniformly accounts of recovery. Individuals who had experienced episodes for days or weeks eventually found the episodes ending. the laughing and crying giving way to the ordinary quiet of a morning where the symptoms had simply finally stopped. The schools that closed eventually reopened. The communities in the Kagera region continued their lives. What happened to them, to those specific girls at Kashasha and in Shamba and at Ramashini and Kanyangereka, and in the additional communities the epidemic reached before it ran its course, was real. It was confusing and physically exhausting and disruptive in practical ways, disrupting the school calendar and the daily routines of communities that had already been managing considerable transition. But it was not permanent. It passed through the way something moves through a landscape and then is gone, leaving the landscape more or less as it was, holding the memory of what passed through it in the way that places hold things without announcing them. The Kashasha school is still there. And that fact, when it arrives, carries a particular kind of weight. Not dramatic weight, but the plain, quiet weight of time continuing after a story has ended. The building that housed the dormitories, where those first episodes began in January 1962, the classrooms where teachers stood in doorways, speaking in measured voices to students who could not stop laughing, the grounds where the school bell rang each morning, and the sound moved outward over the red-earthed paths toward the lake. Those walls still stand. The school still operates as an educational site. Children still come to it, still sit in classrooms, still move through the particular rhythms of institutional life that school buildings carry in their schedules and their bells and their rows of desks. The lake is still visible from the higher windows. Lake Victoria, wide and flat and silver gray in the early morning, the largest lake in Africa, older than the communities that have always oriented themselves by its presence, continues at the edge of the land in the way that large bodies of water continue, indifferent to particular decades, available as a horizon for anyone who looks. The school stands near it, as it has always stood. The paths around it are still red with the laterite soil that the Kagera region's landscape is made of. The low hills are still in the distance. What the building holds now is the ordinary sound of children at lessons, questions asked, answers given, a teacher writing on a chalkboard, a door opening onto a morning that is bright and unremarkable and not in any particular way different from the mornings that surrounded it. The 1962 epidemic is not present in that building in any visible way. It is present in the archived reports in Dar es Salaam. It is present in the academic literature where Hempelman and others cite it. It is present in the memory of the region, held in the way that significant things are held, not always at the surface, not always named, but there. The question of why mass psychogenic illness happens, and why it happens when it does, and why it moves through some populations and not others, is not fully answered. The 1962 Tanganyika epidemic made the question more precise without closing it. The negative biological tests told researchers something definitive about what the condition was not. The demographic patterns, the adolescent girls in institutional settings, the supervising adults who did not develop symptoms, the recovery of affected individuals when they were removed from the social environment of the episodes, told researchers something suggestive about the conditions that made the condition possible. The historical comparisons with Strasbourg and other documented episodes told researchers something about the consistency of the pattern across time and culture. But the full account of how a shared stress in a population finds its way into the body and then spreads from body to body through social channels, that account is still being assembled. This is not an unsatisfying place to rest. Most interesting questions are still open. The ones that have been most thoroughly examined are often the ones that open onto further questions rather than closing into final answers. The 1962 epidemic produced a record careful enough to generate real analysis, and the analysis generated real understanding, and the understanding raised further questions that remain genuinely open and genuinely interesting to the researchers who study them. The school still stands. The lake is still there. The question continues. Christian Hempelman, reading through the photocopied investigation documents at his desk at Purdue University, would have been reading pages that were blurred slightly at the edges from reproduction, the original documents far away in Tanzanian archives, the Kagera region present on his desk only as text. The names in the records were real names. The dates were real dates. The village of Nshamba and the town of Bukoba and the shore of Lake Victoria were all real places that he had, most likely, never visited. The distance between a desk in Indiana and a borrowed room in the Kagera region in 1962 is a particular kind of distance, not only geographical but temporal, the distance between the moment when something was happening and the moment when it became available for analysis. The records bridged that distance. The medical officers who wrote them made the bridging possible. The government medical officer at his table in that borrowed room with the blank page and the date and the village name was writing for people he could not have imagined. He was making a record of a thing he did not yet understand, in a year when the country he worked for had only just become itself, on the shore of a lake older than any of the categories being used to describe what was happening near it. He wrote carefully. The ink dried on the page. The pages were filed and then archived and then decades later read again. There is something in the simple persistence of a document. The notebook closed, the record made, the episode still in progress outside the borrowed room's window. And then the years, and then the copies, and then the desk at Purdue, and the careful reading. History often works like this, through the patient accumulation of records that were not made for any audience in particular, only made because someone in a specific place on a specific day took the time to write down what they saw. The 1962 epidemic lasted approximately 18 months from beginning to end, resolving gradually as the conditions that had sustained it shifted and as affected individuals recovered, and as the social environments of the affected communities settled into new rhythms. No one announced its end. There was no final case, no definitive closing date, no moment at which the last episode occurred and someone recorded it as such. It simply became less and less present, and then it was gone, in the way that things end when they end not with a boundary, but with a fading. What remained was the landscape, the Kagera region in its particular light and texture, the red paths, the lake, the low hills, the market days in Bukoba, the sounds of the regional roads. The schools reopened. Eventually, the students who had been sent home came back or moved on to the next stage of their lives. The teachers returned to their classrooms. The mission at Kashasha continued its operation. The bell was rung at the same hour each morning, and the sound moved outward across the landscape as it always had, and the ordinary rhythms of the institution reassembled themselves around the space where the epidemic had been. Julius Nyerere governed a nation that was still learning what it was. The flag had been raised in December 1961, and the first year of independence was full of the practical, concrete work of building new institutions on the ground where old ones had stood. The epidemic that passed through the Kagera region in that first year was one of many things that year held, not the most significant, not the most consequential for the country's future, but present in the record, documented, real. A school teacher had become a head of state. Three girls at a mission school near Lake Victoria had begun to laugh one afternoon in January and could not stop. Both things happened in the same year, in the same small country, in the same particular historical moment. The archive holds both. The researchers who work on mass psychogenic illness today carry the 1962 Tanganyika epidemic as one of their primary reference points. They cite it in lectures, in papers, in chapters of textbooks that sit on university library shelves in many countries. The pages open to paragraphs about the Kagera region and the demographic patterns and the negative biological tests. Students read those paragraphs. Some of them write in the margins. The pencil marks accumulate in the white space beside the text, which is itself the accumulation of what came before it, the investigation, the archive, the analysis, the citation. All of that has its origin in a specific afternoon in January 1962, when three girls sitting together near the end of a school day began to laugh. The day had been long, the lessons had been conducted, the bell had rung. The school operated according to the schedule it had always operated on, and the dormitories held their rows of neatly made beds. And the lake was somewhere to the north, and the paths leading away from the school grounds were red with the soil they had always been made of. And then, in that particular ordinary end of a particular ordinary afternoon, something began that would be written about and analyzed and cited for the rest of the century and into the next one. The girls who were there are not named in the publicly available record. The documentation that exists gives ages, symptom profiles, onset dates, durations. It does not give names, or at least not names that have entered the wider literature. They are present in the record as numbers and as patterns, their experiences reduced to the categories available for recording them, the categories serving their purpose, which was to make the episodes legible to investigators who had not been there and to researchers who would come much later. The girls themselves would be old women now, if they were alive. The afternoon of January 30th, 1962, would be more than 60 years behind them. Whether they know or have ever known that what happened in that afternoon became a case study in academic journals, a paragraph in textbooks on abnormal psychology, a reference point in lectures delivered in universities they have never visited. There is no way of knowing. The school stands. The lake is still there. The water at the edge of the land carries the same quality it has always carried, that particular silver-gray flatness in the early morning, the brightness of it, visible from the higher paths as a kind of fixed point, orienting the surrounding landscape. The way large bodies of water orient the places that grow up near them. It has been doing this longer than anyone now living can remember, longer than the school, longer than the paths, longer than the records. The investigation ended. The reports were filed. The epidemic resolved. The years passed. The documents traveled from archived files to photocopied pages to a desk in Indiana to paragraphs in textbooks to lecture slides in rooms that the government medical officer in his borrowed room could not have imagined any more than he could have imagined the desk at Purdue. What he wrote down was enough. The date at the top of the page, the village name below it, and then, line by careful line, what he had seen outside the window of that borrowed room in 1962. The afternoon was doing whatever the afternoon does in the Kagera region in the middle of the year, the particular quality of light over the lake, the texture of the red roads, the low hills holding their familiar shapes against whatever was happening among the people moving between them. The land was not interested in the investigation. The lake was not recording the epidemic. The paths did not retain what had walked along them. Only the notebook did that, and the notebook is why any of this can be said at all. The school bell at Kashasha rang each morning at the same hour. The sound moved outward over the school grounds, over the red-earthed paths, over the low hills, toward the lake. It was a sound that belonged to a specific institution in a specific place, marking the beginning of a specific routine. And then, one morning, in March 1962, the gates stood open and the students filed out onto the road, carrying their bundles, the lake of brightness on the northern horizon, the road ahead of them, the same road it had always been, leading toward the villages and the home compounds and the cook fires and the familiar particular smells of the lives they had come from.